Crucifixion, a spectacle of agony and shame. Countless unnamed victims, left to writhe in public view. It is an execution method so horrific that Rome reserved it for the lowest of the low. Yet paradoxically, it gave rise to one of the world's most potent religious symbols. So how did this cruel practice originate, evolve across cultures, and come to carry such a profound meaning? Today, we'll talk about the history of crucifixion, from its ancient origins in the Near East to its use by Imperial Rome, from its role in religious narrative to its variations in method and eventual abolition, and finally, to its lasting legacy as a symbol. We'll go through a journey through time, and we'll talk about how an instrument of terror became in later memory an emblem of faith and sacrifice, and why the story of crucifixion continues to captivate and appall us in equal measure. But not before I welcome you to the channel. It's going to be somewhat of a bleak topic. Seems to be the trend of things that people like to enjoy on here, but that's okay. We talk about it all. I would like to invite you to, if you enjoy the content, like and subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from below in the comments. I've also got a pretty nifty little merch store and a Patreon, if anyone feels inclined to have a look at that. And now, without further ado, let's get nice and comfortable, and we may begin. And where else to begin than from the origins in ancient civilizations? You see, the crucifixion tradition did not begin with the Romans. The roots of this practice reach back into the ancient Near East. Early evidence suggests that the Assyrians, notorious for their cruelty, were pioneers of impaling and displaying enemies on stakes. Assyrian kings boasted of such atrocities in inscriptions in one 8th century BC record of Tiglath-Pileser III, who was extremely brutal if you've watched my video on him, describes how he, I quote, hung up a conquered king in front of his city on a stake, and how others speak of rebels impaled in rows. This practice of suspending victims as a warning was a forerunner to crucifixion. The method evolved over time. As one historian notes, crucifixion is first attested among the Persians, perhaps derived from the Assyrian impalement. In other words, the idea of fixing a human body to a wooden post, whether by impaling or binding, was already present in the Near East, and would be developed further in subsequent empires. The Persians provided first clear records of true crucifixion-like executions. In 519 BC, after the capture of Babylon, King Darius I reportedly crucified, or perhaps impaled, about 3,000 of the city's leading citizens to quash a rebellion. The Greek historian Herodotus writes of this massacre, and an inscription of Darius himself commands that the rebel leader and his chief followers be crucified in Babylon. To the Persians, nailing or binding enemies to a tall wooden structure was an extreme punishment that displayed imperial power. Likewise, sources indicate the Persians used crucifixion against political enemies, and even as a punishment for high treason, a fate arguably worse than death itself, given its terrorizing impact. From Persia, the practice likely passed itself on to other cultures. The ancient Carthaginians, for example, made a grim use of crucifixion too. In ancient Carthage, a general who failed in battle might pay with his life on the cross. During the First Punic War, 3rd century BC, Carthage crucified a commander for losing a crucial city to the Romans. According to one account, when a Carthaginian general permitted Rome to invade Sicily, he was recalled and promptly nailed to a cross, punishment for his incompetence. Crucifixion served as the harshest penalty in the Carthaginian military code, a brutal management of failure that stood in contrast, of course, to Rome's tendency to either exile or fine defeated generals. But of course, Rome wasn't the most gentle with their punishments either. And Carthaginian cruelty didn't stop there, by the way. During the Mercenary War, around 240 BC, both Carthaginians and their revolting mercenaries crucified captives in retaliation, a bloody tit for tat that showed how commonplace this method had become. But it wasn't just them. The Hellenistic Greeks also adopted crucifixion in certain circumstances, mainly during wartime. Although classical Greek city-states generally preferred other forms of execution, like hemlock poisoning or stoning, the influence of Persian practices made itself felt after Alexander the Great's conquests. In 332 BC, after Alexander's army finally breached the fortified island city of Tyre, the enraged conqueror ordered some 2,000 Tyrian survivors to be crucified along the shoreline. Ancient sources describe the gruesome scene of hundreds of crosses with screaming, dying men arrayed by the sea as an object lesson to any city who dared resist Alexander's will. This mass crucifixion at Tyre is the earliest large-scale use of the punishment in the Mediterranean world, and it shows that by the late 4th century BC, crucifixion, whether by nailing or binding victims to a cross or stake, was already known across various cultures as the ultimate penalty, reserved for dire offenses, and often carried out with public flair for maximum intimidation. In the centuries that followed, crucifixion became especially associated with the military and judicial might of Rome. Of course, the Romans didn't invent crucifixion, but they did perfect it. By the late Republic period, crucifixion was the supreme penalty for rebels, slaves, and the lowest criminals. The Romans themselves viewed it with horror. The statesman Cicero called it a most cruel and disgusting punishment, and insisted that the very word cross, Latin crux, should be far removed from the thoughts of any Roman citizen. It was a punishment explicitly kept for non-citizens, slaves, foreigners, rebels, or for citizens guilty of the worst treason. This legal and social boundary speaks to how degrading crucifixion was in Roman eyes. A Roman citizen, like St. Paul, could usually not be crucified, while a rebellious slave or provincials would usually be made an example of. One of the most notorious mass crucifixions under Rome came in 71 BC, following the defeat of the gladiator Spartacus and his rebel army. After a brutal campaign, the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus crushed the slave revolt. To send an unmistakable message, 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, from Capua to Rome. Ancient reports describe this ghastly installation of crosses lining the highway for miles. It was a forest of the dying and the dead. Those who were not left screaming were already rotting. A warning to any slave who dared to dream of freedom. The mass crucifixion of Spartacus's followers was Rome's grim way of asserting its authority. It burned the horror of crucifixion into the historical record as the ultimate deterrent. Roman writers noted that no tombs or rites were given to these victims. Their bodies remained on the crosses long after death as carrion for vultures. The Appian Way crucifixions are a textbook example of how Rome wielded this kind of terror. The punishment was not only death, but the public humiliation and the prolonged suffering that preceded it. And so, during the peak of the Roman Empire, crucifixion was a common fate for robbers, insurgents, and any who threatened Roman rule. Nowhere is more starkly documented than in the brutal suppression of the Jewish revolt in 70 CE. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian who witnessed the siege of Jerusalem, recounts Roman soldiers crucified hundreds of Jews in full view of the city walls. When captives or defectors fell into Roman hands, they were first scourged and tortured, and then crucified in the sight of as many onlookers as possible. He notes that the Romans nailed their victims in different postures as cruel sport, and that so many were executed, 500 or more a day, that there was no more room for the crosses, and no crosses for the bodies. The ghastly image of Jerusalem's walls, ringed with crosses, with soldiers joking as they nailed people up, shows the calculated sadism of crucifixion. It was not merely killing, it was psychological warfare, giving them all a kind of PTSD, so much that they'd warn their grandchildren never to step out of line. Even the Roman general, Titus, Josephus adds, pitied the spectacle, but continued it, hoping to break the morale of the besieged. In the end, crucifixion did terrorize the population, but it also left a stain on Rome's legacy. Amid the countless crucifixions recorded in the ancient world, two singular events stand out for their lasting cultural impact. The first occurred around 88 BC in Jerusalem, when the Hasmonean king Alexander Jannaeus crucified 800 of his political enemies in one day, Pharisee rebels. According to later reports, Jannaeus even staged a banquet with his concubines as he watched the victims die. This episode during the late Jewish kingdom demonstrated that crucifixion had entered the repertoire of punishments in the Near East by Hellenistic times. Even Jewish rulers, under Greek influence, employed it against their own people. The Jewish historian Josephus later recorded this atrocity, ensuring that it would not be forgotten. Of course, the second, far better known event is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ in approximately 30 to 33 CE under Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of Judea. Now, in many ways, the execution was a routine Roman crucifixion of a provincial troublemaker. That's how they saw it. One of perhaps thousands carried out in the era. Now, if we're going to go by the Gospels, it describes it as Jesus being scourged, forced to carry the cross beam, and then nailed to the cross between two thieves at a site called Golgotha. This was entirely in line with Roman practice. Crucifixion was often preceded by flogging to weaken the condemned, and victims were often made to carry the crossbeam to the execution site. Nails were driven through the wrists or forearms, and the feet or heels. Not the hands, by the way. They were never driven through the hands, because if you were to drive them through the hands, the hands would not hold the weight of the body. They would simply rip off, basically, so you had to have a stronger joint in the wrists. A bit of trivia there. So when you see those depictions with the nails through the hands, that is actually not correct. Well, of course, once these were driven through, they might linger alive for hours or even days after. In Jesus' case, the process was expedited. He died within a few hours, perhaps due to severe scourging or other factors, and a soldier pierced his side with a spear to ensure his death too. At the time, this execution barely registered in the Roman records, by the way, yet it became the most famous execution in history, because Jesus' followers later preached that he rose from the dead, transforming the cross from a symbol of shame into a central icon in Christianity. Roman historians like Tacitus and Jewish writers like Josephus acknowledge Jesus' crucifixion as a historical event. Tacitus notes that Christ suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilatus, but they could have hardly guessed the religious significance that it would assume later on, of course. Now, crucifixion's prominence in the Roman world is further underscored by smaller anecdotes and practices. For example, the Romans customarily posted the crime of the condemned on a sign above their head on the cross, hence the gospel mention of the sign, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. They kind of put that on there as a way to mock him, almost. saying, "Look at this king. This is their king. Look at what we done to him." No, they was kind of like that. Roman law even had nuances like denying burial to crucified criminals, though exceptions were sometimes made. We also see Romans using crucifixion in quelling slave revolts and provincial uprisings, Spartan revolt and those in Judea. A particularly gruesome touch is recorded by writers like Seneca, was that the executioners sometimes varied in the crucifixion pose. Some were knelt upside down or even in contorted positions to amuse the crowd. This is clear that by the imperial period, crucifixion had become a well-institutionalized policy. It was simultaneously a method of execution and a public ritual of domination, a way to state, "This is what happens when you don't do what you're told." So the practice of crucifixion, being so widespread in antiquity, naturally made its way into the religious narratives and texts of various cultures. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, crucifixion holds a central and almost paradoxical place. In the Hebrew Bible, that being the Old Testament, there's no instance of Israelites executing someone by crucifixion. Such a practice was alien to ancient Jewish law. However, there is a related concept, hanging on a tree. Deuteronomy 21:23 commanded that if a criminal was executed, usually by stoning, his body could be hung on a tree as a further public display, but it must be taken down by nightfall. Now, this was not crucifixion to death, but a post-mortem shaming ritual. Later Jewish writers would connect this idea of being hung on a tree to crucifixion, interpreting a crucified person as under God's curse, an interpretation early Christians had to grapple with in explaining Jesus' death. Now, during the Hellenistic period, Jewish history sadly records actual crucifixions. The aforementioned mass crucifixion of 800 Pharisees by Alexander Jannaeus is noted in Josephus's Antiquities and in later Jewish memory. The dramatic event showed up in religious discourse as well. It exemplified the suffering of the righteous and the brutality of leaders who strayed from God's law. In decades later, when the Syrian Greek ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes tried to stamp out Judaism around 167 BC, it is said that he crucified those who resisted Hellenization. According to First Maccabees and Josephus, some devout Jews who refused to forsake their traditions were not only executed, but hung on stakes in public. Thus, by the time of Jesus, crucifixion was a known threat in the Jewish consciousness under foreign rule, almost like a sign of pagan oppression. In Christianity, crucifixion takes on an entirely new significance because of Jesus Christ. What was a horrific punishment became, in Christian belief, the means of humanity's salvation. It's all a little bit ironic. The New Testament devotes considerable attention to the crucifixion of Jesus, describing it in detail in all four Gospels. Early Christians did not gloss over the scandal of the cross. Instead, they emphasized it. The Apostle Paul wrote, "We preach Christ crucified, stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles," acknowledging that a crucified Messiah was shocking to both Jewish and Greco-Roman sensibilities. Yet this very shock became the linchpin of their entire theology. Jesus' willing death on a cross was seen as a redemptive sacrifice. Over the centuries, the cross, a traditional object of shame, was transformed into the preeminent symbol of their faith, representing self-giving love and sacrifice of victory over death. This profound reframing is evident in how Christians began to use the symbol of the cross, in art, on church buildings, and in rituals. An astonishing outcome, given that the cross had been viewed with horror just a generation before. However, the first few centuries of Christianity existed in the shadow of the Roman use of crucifixion. Christians themselves sometimes became its victims. During persecutions, crucifixion was the one method which believers were martyred. For example, tradition holds that St. Peter was crucified in Rome under Emperor Nero, and by his own request, he was crucified upside down, feeling unworthy to die in the exact same manner as Jesus. Earlier Christian texts and legends recount Peter's upside-down crucifixion, as well as the crucifixion of St. Andrew on an X-shaped cross, hence the term St. Andrew's Cross. Now these stories, whether legendary or historical, still up for a debate for quite a lot of people, but they still indicate that crucifixion remained a very real threat and a reality for Christians in the Roman Empire. Interestingly, the earliest surviving pictorial representation of Jesus' crucifixion is not a reverent icon made by Christians, but a crude graffiti, likely drawn by a pagan mocking the new faith. Discovered on the Palatine Hill in Rome, the so-called Anaximenos graffito, 2nd century CE, shows a stick-figure man worshipping a crucified figure with a donkey's head. The scrawled Greek caption reads, "Anaximenos worships his god." In other words, someone was just ridiculing a Christian guy called Anaximenos by portraying his god as a donkey on a cross. This graffito is a vivid testament of how scandalous the idea of a crucified deity was to the Roman mind, a point of derision. Yet to the Christians, what was foolishness to others became a point of pride. By the 4th century, crosses and crucifixes would adorn the churches, and the Roman instrument of execution was fully reinterpreted as the tree of life in Christian thought. Other religious traditions also engage with crucifixion, albeit in different ways. In Islamic tradition, crucifixion is acknowledged, but with significant theological twist regarding Jesus. The Quran mentions the crucifixion of Jesus, but pointedly declares, "They did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it was made to appear so to them." It's Quran 4:157. In Islamic belief, God rescued Jesus from the fate of crucifixion, and perhaps someone else was made to resemble him and was crucified in his place. Thus, Islam denies the crucifixion and death of Jesus Christ, considering the idea of a prophet of God dying in such a manner as somewhat unfitting. Nevertheless, the Quran does accept crucifixion as a real practice historically. Indeed, another verse, Quran 5:33, prescribes crucifixion as one of the possible punishments for severe crimes, like banditry or treason against God and the Prophet. Several early Islamic rulers did use crucifixion in this sense. For example, the Abbasid Caliphate on occasion crucified the corpses of executed rebels or heretics as a kind of post-mortem punishment. A notable case is the famed mystic Al-Hallaj in 922 CE, after he was executed for heresy. His body was gibbeted, that is, crucified on a post, and displayed publicly. Thus, in the Islamic world, crucifixion was generally seen as a fate for the worst criminals, and sometimes as an additional indignity after execution. It was never celebrated, as in Christianity. Rather, it remained a feared punishment and a symbol of shame or divine curse. But beyond the Abrahamic faiths, crucifixion has less of a footprint, but there are a few echoes. In ancient India and China, crucifixion was not a standard method. Other gruesome methods like impalement or dismemberment were more common, so it's rarely noted in Eastern religious texts. However, in Buddhist history, there is a striking story from Japan's persecution of Christians. In 1597, 26 Christian martyrs in Nagasaki, including foreign missionaries and Japanese converts, were crucified for their faith. They were tied or nailed to crosses on a hill and then pierced with spears, an execution ordered by Toyotomi Hideyoshi's regime to quash the new religion. The martyrs were later canonized in Catholic tradition. While this event is more historical than scriptural, it shows how crucifixion took on religious significance in a context far removed from Rome, as a test of faith and a form of martyrdom. In Japanese culture, where crucifixion was known as haritsuke, this method gained a dark aura due to such incidents, a foreign faith's adherents suffering an imported form of death. And so, in summary, crucifixion left a deep imprint on religious thought. For Jews and Muslims, it often symbolized disgrace and was a tool of tyrants, something that the righteous would ideally be spared from. But for Christians, it became paradoxically a sign of glory, a wondrous symbol on which God's love was displayed. Certainly shows how context and belief utterly transform one's interpretations. Although the term crucifixion conjures up a specific image, a person nailed to a Latin cross shape, that crux in practice, the methods and apparatus of crucifixion varied widely across different times and places. The one common element was the binding or nailing of a living person to a wooden frame, now whether that be a pole, a cross, or a tree, and leaving them to die. But within that definition there wasn't much room for innovation and cruelty. In the classical world, Romans used several shapes of crosses. The simplest was just an upright stake in the ground, crux simplex, to which a victim could be tied. More often a crossbeam was used, forming a T-shaped cross, or the familiar shape, the crux immissa, with a protruding top with the titular sign. Now, archaeological evidence and literary descriptions show that victims' arms were either nailed or tied to the crossbeam, and the feet were even nailed to the vertical post, or sometimes supported on a small wooden ledge, sedile or footrest, to prolong the agony. A famous discovery in 1968 in Jerusalem revealed the heel bone of a first-century crucified man, with an iron nail still transfixed through it. Astonishingly, the nail had bent, fixing a fragment of wood against the bone. Analysis of his remains showed that each foot had been nailed separately to the sides of the cross through the heel, rather than one nail through both feet as often depicted. His arms bore no nail markings, suggesting his wrists may have simply just been tied to the beam. Now this find's pretty important, because it provided the first physical confirmation of Roman crucifixion practice. The positioning of nails implied a straddled stance, and the absence of arm wounds implied ropes were also used. It demonstrates that the Romans did whatever was effective to secure a person, nails where needed, ropes elsewhere, and that the classical artistic image of crucifixion with nails through the palm and feet might not tell the whole mechanical story. But the agony of crucifixion came not only from the pain of the nails, but from the victim's own weight and the struggle to breathe. Typically, death came by a combination of factors: shock, blood loss, dehydration, and asphyxiation. As the victim grew weaker, they could no longer lift themselves to inhale, leading to slow suffocation. The Romans, fully aware of this, sometimes hastened death by breaking the legs, so the victim could no longer push up to breathe, causing a quicker asphyxiation. In the New Testament, the soldiers break the legs of two thieves crucified alongside Jesus to speed their demise, whereas Jesus, found already dead, had his legs left intact, and instead pierced with a spear for confirmation. Well, this suggests that even in execution, there was a grim protocol. If one needed the execution finished sooner, leg breaking was an acceptable expedient. Otherwise, the torture might continue until nature took its course. But outside the Roman world, methods of crucifixion showed cultural adaptation. Nowhere is this more prevalent than in Japan, where crucifixion, haritsuke, became a method of capital punishment during the 16th to 19th centuries, that is, the Asuchi Momoyama and Edo periods. The Japanese had learned of crucifixions partly through contact with Christian missionaries. Ironically, they then used it against the Christians and criminals. Not exactly what the Christians wanted to take from the new religion, but, well, it must have been a bit of a cultural miscommunication, I suppose. But you see, Japanese crucifixion developed its own distinctive procedures. It's been described in detail. The condemned was first paraded publicly in a humiliating procession on horseback, then tied to a wooden cross made of one vertical pole and two cross pieces. Once the cross was erected, executioners would stab the victim multiple times with spears, typically from both sides of the body, puncturing vital areas. Finally, a last thrust through the throat or heart brought death. The body would be left on display for a time, often 3 days as a warning. In cases where a prisoner attempted to take their own life or died before crucifixion, the Japanese authorities would even crucify the corpse, tying the dead body to a cross to fulfill a sentence post-mortem. An especially cruel variant in Japan, under the warlord Hideyoshi, was Sakasa Haritsuke, that's a long word, or in English, inverted crucifixion, where the victim was hung upside down on the cross. Japan also devised a form of water crucifixion. The victim was tied to a stake at the seashore at low tide and slowly drowned as the tide rose. This method was often reserved for persecuted Christians, forcing a prolonged and terrorizing ordeal that could last days while the victim intermittently suffocated as waves washed over them. The fact that such specific terms and methods existed in Japan indicates how crucifixion, once introduced, was systematized to fit the Japanese penal culture. It became the default execution for heinous crimes, like the murder of one's lord or parent, or a very specific affront to the social order. Men were usually crucified on a cross structure, whereas women might be tied to an upright stake with a small platform, and then also pierced with spears. A gender difference in method noted some records of Edo period justice. Overall, Japanese crucifixion was as much about display and deterrence as the Roman version, though the use of spears meant death came somewhat faster than purely prolonged Roman style. Elsewhere in Asia, there were comparable practices. In Burma, Myanmar, in the early 19th century, executions sometimes incorporated crucifixions combined with mutilation. An eyewitness account by the missionary Felix Carey in 1807 describes how condemned criminals were nailed to a wooden scaffold and then subjected to horrific tortures. Tongues cut out, ears sliced off, bellies opened, while affixed in the cruciform position. In some cases, the victims lingered for days on the crosses before dying. Such reports show that even outside the West, the concept of nailing a person in place to torment them had emerged independently, or simply through influence, but adapted into local spectacles. Well, Europe after Roman times did not commonly practice crucifixion, thanks largely to its strong association with Christian reverence, of course. But analogous punishments did exist. Medieval and early modern Europe sometimes used the gibbet after execution by hanging or breaking on the wheel. The criminal's body might be hung in an iron cage or from chains from a post, essentially a post-mortem crucifixion, to let it rot as a warning to others. Well, while not a crucifixion per se, the symbolism was somewhat similar. The criminal displayed on high denied burial, becoming an object lesson in crime and punishment. In a few rare instances, live gibbeting occurred, where the person was locked in a hanging cage to die of thirst or exposure. The psychological impact was akin to crucifixion, though the mechanics did differ. One could also consider the punishment of impalement, historically used in parts of Asia and Europe, notoriously by Vlad Tepes Dracula in 15th century Wallachia, a close cousin of crucifixion. In impalement, a stake is driven through the victim's body, often vertically, and the person is left there to die, sometimes over many hours. While methodically distinct, the end result is the public display of a dying victim on a pole, which is essentially what crucifixion achieves. Some ancient reports of crucifixion in Assyria or Persia might have actually been describing impalement, given the overlap in terminology. In fact, the Greek word anastauro can either mean to impale or crucify, so that makes things a little bit difficult. Thus, the line between crucifixion and just general impalements can somewhat blur in the historical records. But either way, it's not good. Not good at all. Well, in terms of the apparatus, crosses themselves could take different shapes. The X-shaped cross, or saltire, became famous as an instrument of St. Andrew's martyrdom, hence called St. Andrew's Cross. The inverted cross is traditionally associated with St. Peter. The T shape, the crux commissa, is sometimes argued in the form used for Jesus' cross, as it was a common execution stake, with the titulus perhaps nailed to the top of the T, or hung around the victim's neck. There is even a reference in Roman literature to the X-shaped cross and other unusual configurations. Romans were not too rigid about the form, more the function. Seneca the Younger, around 65 CE, wrote, "I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but many made in different ways. Some have their victims with their head down to the ground, some impale their private parts, others stretch out their arms on the gibbet." Pretty grim catalogue, don't you think? But despite these variations, the core experience for the victim remained consistent: excruciating pain, thirst, exposure, and public humiliation, often lasting for an agonizing length of time. The word excruciating itself actually comes from the Latin ex cruce, out of the cross. Reflects the agony associated with crucifixion, of course. Each culture that practiced crucifixion left its own stamp on the method, whether adding spear thrusts, modifying the cross's shape, or combining it with other tortures. But in all cases, the goal was to make death as tormenting and exemplary as possible. This understanding of crucifixion variations only amplifies our appreciation of how feared and loathed a punishment it certainly was. As the late ancient world transitioned into the early medieval era, crucifixion gradually disappeared as an official form of execution. Several factors contribute to its decline, but a key turning point was the influence of Christianity once it became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. In 313 CE, Emperor Constantine the Great converted to Christianity, and soon thereafter issued edicts that began to transform Roman laws and punishment, enlighten the Christian sensibilities rather. According to later chronicles, Constantine had a special reverence for the cross because of his vision of the cross before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Eusebius of Caesarea and other Christian writers note that Constantine viewed the crucifixion of Jesus as a sacred event, not to be sullied by continued use of crosses for execution. Thus, Constantine abolished crucifixion as a punishment within the Roman Empire, likely by edict in the early 4th century. One account by the historian Aurelius Victor states that Constantine was the first to remove the long-established and utterly horrid punishment of the cross, out of pious respect. In practical terms, this meant that from the 320 CE onward, Roman courts stopped sentencing people to die by crucifixion. The cross was no longer a tool of the executioner. It was now, in a sense, if we can use the word redeemed from its bloody past. While this imperial ban on crucifixion was a landmark in the history of capital punishment, it was one of the first instances of a major empire abolishing a form of execution largely for humanitarian and religious reasons. But it's important to note that by the 4th century, crucifixion had also become somewhat redundant in Roman law, because the empire had fewer mass slave revolts or provincial rebellions to suppress in such a dramatic fashion. Other punishments, such as beheading, which was quicker, or damnatio ad bestias, throwing criminals to wild beasts in the arena, which served as entertainment, began to take precedence. I don't know how that aligns with Christian sensibilities, but apparently it does. But the moral weight of crucifixion of Christ undoubtedly hastened its end. In fact, by the late 4th and 5th centuries, Christian poets and theologians were waxing eloquent about the cross in purely mystical terms, with scarcely a memory that it had once been feared the instrument of death. Even as Roman crucifixion faded, elsewhere the practice had lingered longer. In parts of the world beyond direct Roman or Christian influence, crucifixion continued into the Middle Ages, and even the early modern period. In the Islamic world, as mentioned, crucifixion was practiced occasionally by various dynasties. However, as Islamic law developed, it was generally reserved as a post-mortem punishment, or a punitive display. Over time, the actual crucifixion of live persons became extremely rare in Islamic jurisdictions, partly because alternative execution methods were preferred, and partly because of the logistical complexity of crucifixion. By the Ottoman period, for example, impalement had largely taken place of crucifixion for terrifying executions. Thus, in the Middle East and North Africa, it was mostly phased out by the early modern era, surviving only as a symbolic threat or an extraordinary measure. In Japan, crucifixion persisted into the 19th century as a legal penalty under the Tokugawa shogunate. The Edo period penal codes prescribed crucifixions for certain heinous crimes, and for Christians who defied the ban on their religion. It was a standard part of the justice system in Japan until they opened up to the West. Under pressure to modernize and influenced by Western legal norms, Japan officially abolished crucifixion in the early Meiji Restoration period. By 1871 to 73, the new Meiji government had removed crucifixion from the criminal code, replacing it with more modern methods, like hanging. The last recorded crucifixions in Japan occurred just before these reforms. For instance, there are records of a man crucified in 1864 in Yokohama for murder, and possibly a few during the upheavals around 1868. But after 1870, such sentences cease. The end of crucifixion in Japan thus came as a part of a broader wave of penal reform and westernization. In a broader sense, crucifixion as a state-sanctioned practice died out because societies gradually found it too barbaric or too laden with negative connotation. The rise of Christianity made it unthinkable in Europe, and later the rise of the Enlightenment values worldwide made such torturous executions completely unacceptable. By the late 19th century, around the globe, crucifixion was effectively extinct. It joined the ranks of ancient punishments that modern sensibilities and legal standards have rejected, alongside practices like burning at the stake, flaying, or breaking on the wheel. But while crucifixion as an execution method may have vanished in the history books, its legacy endures powerfully in culture, religion, and art. In fact, no other method of execution has left such a deep imprint on human consciousness. In fact, the word crucifixion itself now transcends its literal meaning. It often denotes any torment or severe trial. We often speak of someone being crucified by the media, for instance. This metaphorical usage is a direct legacy of how notorious it was. Now, first and foremost, the symbol of the cross has become ubiquitous to Christianity. I think it's pretty obvious. It is one of the great ironies of history that an instrument of humiliation and agony was adopted by the Christians as an emblem of their faith. Starting with the 4th century, once crucifixion was no longer in use, depictions of Christ on the cross, that crucifix, became central to Christian worship and art. Churches were built in the shape of crosses. Pilgrims sought relics of the true cross. Helena, Constantine's mother, was said to have found the remnants of Jesus' cross in Jerusalem, by the way. And over time, the cross came to symbolize salvation, hope, and the intersection of divine love with human suffering. In the arts, endless painters, sculptors, and poets have taken inspiration from the crucifixion, from the serene sacrifice portrayed in Renaissance paintings to the harrowing modern sculptures that try to capture the anguish. The image of the crucified Christ became a universal symbol of compassion and sacrifice, recognized far beyond Christian circles. It has inspired compassion, philosophical reflection, and also social action. For example, the crucifixion is often invoked when people see the suffering of the innocent and ask why, echoing the image of Christ's suffering. The cultural legacy of crucifixion is also evident in literature and film. Countless works reference it. Whether explicitly or through crucifixion imagery, writers have long used crucifixion metaphors to convey extreme sacrifice or persecution. For instance, in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, Shylock says, "You take my life, when you do take the means whereby I live." But earlier, he also refers to how you might almost damn the Jew. If you prick us, do we not bleed? Not a crucifixion reference per se, but many literary critics see Shylock and similar characters an echo of martyrdom on the cross, especially in a lot of medieval passion plays, the sometimes caricatured Jews in the stories of the crucifixion. But in some cultures, crucifixion has even entered popular devotion in unusual ways. Every year on Good Friday in certain parts of the Philippines, a small number of devout Catholic Filipinos engage in voluntary crucifixions, and I'm not even joking. They have themselves nailed, with sterilized nails of course, to a wooden cross for a brief time to reenact their Lord's suffering. Though the Church does not endorse this extreme practice, it certainly shows how crucifixion has transformed from something one would desperately avoid into something one might put their hand up for, a demonstration of piety. And outside of religion, the image of crucifixion has often been used for political and social commentary, a symbol of oppression. Political cartoons might depict a figure crucified to represent their being martyred by public opinion. For instance, at sites of genocide or massacre, crosses, even if the victims were not literally crucified, can appear as a visual language for lives cut down cruelly. But in conclusion, the history of crucifixion is a journey from pragmatic brutality to profound symbolism. It began as a way to terrorize and subjugate, used by cruel emperors from Assyria to Rome. It played a role in defining moments of antiquity, the fall of the great rebel Spartacus, the assertion of Carthaginian discipline, the death of a man that the Christians called their savior. It was refined into an art of agony in places as far-flung as Japan, only to be ultimately cast aside as civilization advanced. Yet long after the practice ended, crucifixion lives on in collective memory and cultural conscience. The cross on a church spire, those beautiful buildings, the phrase, bearing one's cross, the very horror we feel at the thought of nailing a person to wood. All these attest the crucifixion left an indelible mark on our history. It's a sobering legacy, sure. Definitely a complex one. It is perhaps the most niche yet simple symbol that we have in humanity. Those two lines, one short, one long, crossing over the other. It reminds us of the depths of cruelty, but it calls us at the same time to the heights of compassion. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly enjoyed it, as macabre as it was. Certainly enjoy it. And now I'm going to thank my top tier patrons. Top tier patrons being Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfenir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro, Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Videoman, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, and Talvery. Thank you very much. And that is the end of our video for today. As always, I invite you to like and subscribe if you feel the need to do so. And on that note, it's my time done. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all, and I will see you next time.